Were we wrong about Shavkat Rakhmonov? Is he not the fighter that could beat Balal Muhammad, the fighter that can become the welterweight champion and take the division to new heights? As one of the most exciting fighters in the UFC, has only one decision win in his entire professional career. Is he in fact overrated? I don't think so in general. He is the number one contender. He's one of the best welterweights currently. But the estimation about Shavkat Rakhmonov was he was the best. Like, he is the absolute top welterweight in the world that can beat Belal Muhammad, that could beat Ian Garry, that could beat Kamaru Usman, Sean Brady, all of these guys. Shavkat was estimated to be that fighter, the most dominant force in the welterweight division. Well, in that sense, if we believe that Shavkat is the best welterweight, I think then he is overrated because he's not the best. He's one of them. He's on par with the other welterweight contenders. And honestly, I think Belal's the best welterweight, and I think Sean Brady might be the second best welterweight. I think Shavkat and Ian Garry are very close, both having a training camp against each other. I think it would be a very even fight. I think Jack Della's on the same skill level. I think Leon's on the same skill level. Current Usman might be a little bit below them. Buckley might be on the same level or a level below them. So that's kind of how I see the hierarchy in terms of who is the best welterweight. Belal, Sean Brady, then like all the other top contenders. Then the mid-ranked fighters, the low-ranked fighters, kind of like that. And I think the one aspect of his game that causes him to be somewhat overrated is his wrestling. So we know he's a very good striker. He doesn't have the best defense, but he's got very good offensive striking. His grappling on the ground is some of the best in the division, but his wrestling might be the weakest of his entire game. The reason why I bring up the question, is he overrated? Have we been wrong about Shavkat's skills? Is mostly based off of the performance of Ian Garry, where he did win the fight. It was somewhat competitive, but in a way that it probably shouldn't have been. Ian Garry is not a fighter who is known for his wrestling skills. He's not a fighter who has shown great takedown defense throughout his career. He stuffed 8 out of 10 takedowns from Shavkat Rakhmonov. 2 of those takedowns were in the 4th round where he shot differently. For the first 3 rounds, Shavkat was trying to take him down against the fence. But in the 4th round, he shot in with more traditional explosive shots from range instead of the clinch. And he got 2 of them in the 4th round. But then he got none in the 5th. He shot 3 times in the 5th round. And Ian Garry stuffed every single one of them. It was like when Ian Garry expected a certain kind of takedown out of Shavkat, he was able to defend it. But if Shavkat exploded with a different technique out of nowhere and surprised Ian Garry with his wrestling, those are the kind of shots that would get Ian Garry to the ground. But that's not the same kind of story when Ian Garry fought these other fighters in the past. And it's not a one fight thing either. Shavkat Rakhmonov also had a difficult time taking down 40-year-old Stephen Thompson, who's past his prime, known for his weak wrestling. Shavkat shot 5 takedowns in the fight and only got 1. Now that one takedown was the one that led to the finish, which shows that Shavkat's ground game on the ground, his submissions, his ground and pound, his top control is absolutely elite. But the wrestling by itself to get it there may have been overestimated. He may not be as good in that area as some of the other fighters, or enough to beat fighters like Belal Muhammad, Kamaru Usman, maybe Jack Della Maddalena, or various other fighters in the welterweight division like Leon Edwards and maybe an Ian Garry in a rematch, because Ian Garry did take that fight against Shavkat on short notice and he was able to stuff almost every single takedown. He didn't even have a full training camp to prepare for that. But then when you look at Stephen Thompson, right, stuffing 4 out of 5 takedowns from Shavkat, he only stuffed 3 out of 7 takedowns from Joaquin Buckley. Does it mean that Buckley's a better wrestler than Shavkat? Not necessarily, but he could be more effective because of how explosive he is with his striking. He's also much shorter, so he can get into that level change quicker than Shavkat can. But then you compare him to someone like Belal Muhammad, who I think is, in fact, the better wrestler out of the two. Belal Muhammad secured almost all 9 takedowns against Stephen Thompson, completely out-wrestling him with no problem whatsoever. Gilbert Burns completely out-wrestled Stephen Thompson as well. Got half of his takedowns, 3 out of 6 takedowns, out of Wonder Boy's last 5 fights. The fighter who was the least successful with his wrestling was Shavkat Rakhmonov. Out of Joaquin Buckley, Kevin Holland, Belal Muhammad, and Gilbert Burns, Shavkat had the least success on getting the fight to the ground. Now he had the most success when it comes to finishing the fight, which shows his grappling skill. He is the best finisher out of any of these fighters, but his wrestling seems to be the weakest against the same opponent from those 5 fighters. Now, I do think he's a better wrestler than Kevin Holland. I think he's a better wrestler than Joaquin Buckley, but Buckley is getting much better. I don't think he's a better wrestler than Belal Muhammad, and he might not be as good of a wrestler as Gilbert Burns. Shavkat's takedown accuracy, statistically, is 25%. That is extremely low. He only gets a 4th of the takedowns that he shoots. And this is not a Habib or an Islam or a Hamzat where he chain wrestles in that way. because those guys, even their takedown accuracy is somewhere from 40 to 60%, even though they fail on takedowns when they're not actually trying to get the fight to the ground. Some of their takedowns are used to set up their chain wrestling, right? So it's going to count as like 2 takedowns to get the fighter to the ground. Shavkat is at 25%. That's way below the threshold of using that to chain wrestle predominantly. Now that brings into question, how can he beat someone like Belal, right? Because this is his next matchup. Belal Muhammad is going to have the wrestling advantage. He's going to have the pace. He's going to have the pressure, the cardio, and maybe even the strength advantage against Shavkat. Shavkat got taken down by Ian Garry, who took the fight on short notice, and Shavkat was preparing for Balal Muhammad, and most likely his training camp was about wrestling. Shavkat's takedown defense should have been at the best it's ever been leading up to that fight, and Ian Garry got him to the ground. And that was off of a failed takedown attempt from Shavkat. If that was Belal, if that was Sean Brady, if that was even Gilbert Burns, it would have been much easier for those fighters than it was for Ian Garry. So the argument that Shavkat is this great wrestler has no evidence. There's nowhere to point to that he has this great wrestling. I think when we see his submissions and his ground and pound and his top control, we automatically think that, okay, his takedowns must be really good too, but that is yet to be seen. He's all the way to a title shot, and we haven't really seen him display great wrestling yet. When you really go back and look at his fights, his best takedown he's ever gotten on an opponent was against Ian Garry in that 4th round, which were stuffed in the 5th round. And that was a short notice Ian Garry who didn't have a full training camp for Shavkat. If he did have a full training camp, he would have stuffed even more takedowns. His takedown defense would have been even better for that fight. So if he had a training camp that was focused on defending takedowns, how does he get taken down by Ian Garry? Even once, Ian Garry's not a great wrestler. Ian Garry's best wrestling skills were shown when he took down Michael Page and Neil Magny. Those were the best his wrestling has ever looked against 2 fighters who don't have takedown defense. He also took down Shavkat. But if you look at Shavkat's career, all the fighters he took down, so he struggled to take down Ian Garry. He struggled to take down Stephen Thompson. He could not take down Jeff Neal, who was oversized in the fight. He took down Neil Magny with all 2 of his takedowns, but Neil Magny has some of the worst takedown defense we've ever seen at welterweight. He did take down Carlston Harris, who was a decent wrestler 1 time out of 3, but he finished the fight with his striking. He also took down Michel Prazeres, who's very, very small for the weight class. I mean, the guy's literally 5'6". He's as tall as the flyweights. The only fighter that Shavkat did not struggle wrestling with were Neil Magny and Michel Prazeres. Every other fighter, he struggles somewhat wrestling with them. So honestly, it looks like Shavkat's wrestling is very overrated. His striking and grappling are better than his wrestling. And if you cannot take the fight to the ground against the best fighters in the world, and we're talking about the other top contenders, if he can't take them down, he's gonna have to strike with them most likely, or find a way to choke them out, standing, guillotines, rear naked chokes, whatever it is. Is it striking enough to beat some of these guys? I don't think Shavkat is a better striker than Jack Della Maddalena, and we don't know how good his takedown defense is going to be when he fights Belal Muhammad and Sean Brady, and we don't know how his striking is going to look if he fights Carlos Prates. In fact, actually, I do think Carlos would knock out Shavkat if the fight stays standing, and Carlos has shown good takedown defense so far. I don't know, man. I've been talking about Shavkat for a long time. I've been talking about Shavkat since his 2nd fight in the UFC. I made a whole breakdown starting from there. I've been talking about him ever since. Fight after fight, and I think I may have overestimated him, honestly. I don't think he beats Belal. I don't think he beats Carlos Prates. I don't know if he could beat Sean Brady. A prime Kamaru Usman could have beaten him. If Jack Della Maddalena strengthens that takedown defense, I think he could beat Shavkat as well. But he just beat Ian Garry. What about him? I don't think the world of Ian Garry, honestly. I never did. I think Ian Garry's like a fighter who's going to roam around the top 7. Sometimes he'll be a number 7. Sometimes he'll be a number 4. Something like that. I think he's a good fighter, but he's not like some elite welterweight. His striking in his last few fights has looked like it's declined, strangely enough. He got outstruck by Shavkat, which he really didn't do much in the stand-up. He got completely outstruck by Michael Page. He rarely attempted to throw anything standing. He outstruck Jeff Neal, who fought the fight very differently. I think Jeff Neal, who was more aggressive, could have won that fight. He got dropped by Song Kenan. He ate some big shots from Darian Weeks. The best his striking has ever looked was against Song Kenan after recovering from the knockdown. He looked like an elite level striker in that fight. And also against Daniel Rodriguez. He was too patient against Neil Magny. He did enough to beat Jeff Neal in a split decision. Didn't want anything to do with the stand-up against Michael Page and barely did anything in the stand-up against Shavkat. He landed 42 significant strikes in a 5-round fight. Shavkat landed 37. But I don't think these 2 fighters are going to be the future champions of this division. Or even if they do become champions, let's say Shavkat does knock out Belal Muhammad, hypothetically, like he lands some high kick, crazy knockout, right? I don't see Shavkat reigning over this division for a long time. I think if there is a fighter that could, right now, if it's not Belal Muhammad because he's 36 years old, it might be Sean Brady, a fighter who's well-rounded, who can actually wrestle very well, whose striking has gotten so much better. He could be the next champion with title defenses in the welterweight division. There's also Carlos Prates. Now, it's too soon to say because he hasn't gone up against any of the top guys. He just beat Neil Magny, who is a mutual opponent of Shavkat and Ian Garry. All three of these guys destroyed him. Well, Shavkat and Carlos destroyed him. Ian Garry went to a decision, leg kicking him. If Carlos Prates has enough takedown defense to stop Shavkat's wrestling and to the level to stop Sean Brady's wrestling, that guy might be the dominant force of the welterweight division, but we don't know yet. It's too soon to say. For all we know, he might fight Colby Covington and get wrestled to a decision. We have no idea what his wrestling is going to look like against the better wrestlers of the weight class, but his striking looks very promising. So that's my rant on Shavkat Rakhmonov and what I think about maybe I've been overestimating him. Shavkat's takedowns technically were not like what we see from the other wrestlers in the UFC. When we see the way that Khabib or Islam takedown fighters or Hamza Chimaev or Belal Muhammad or Sean Brady, like these guys' wrestling techniques look way more solid and stronger than Shavkat's, according to the weight classes, of course. I'm not going to say, Islam's stronger than Shavkat, but that's my opinion on it. I could be wrong. Maybe he goes out there and absolutely wrestle clinics Belal Muhammad or something, But to be honest, man, I don't see anyone beating Belal Muhammad. Now, I have certain fighters at welterweight that I like watching, right? I like watching the strikers and I wish they become champions. Like, I would love to see Jack Della Maddalena become a champion, but I just don't think any of them are going to be Belal. I think Belal is going to take that Shavkat 85% takedown defensive rate and drop it to like 45%. I think he does the same thing to Ian Garry. Brings him into a wrestling clinic. I think he does the same thing as Jack Della Maddalena. I think he does the same thing again against Leon Edwards. The only fighter that it seems like can wrestle with him on paper is Sean Brady. Sean Brady is the next well-rounded fighter at welterweight. But the crazy thing about that is, even if Sean Brady, in my opinion, is the second best welterweight right now, Belal TKO'd him standing. There's no one beating Belal. That's what I think. It's like what Khabib said. Khabib talked about the way to beat Belal Muhammad. You have to finish him. You have to knock him out. You have to submit him. There's no way you could beat this guy by a decision. That's what Khabib said. He said Belal Muhammad is too well-rounded. He knows how to do everything. He knows how to strike with you. He knows how to wrestle with you. And he has better cardio than everybody else. He fights at a faster pace currently than anybody else. Fighters are not able to keep up with him. And that's even with the striking because he has the takedown threat. This is what Khabib said about Belal Muhammad, and I agree with it somewhat. I don't think he's the best striker, but he mixes up the game so well that his striking is going to be effective against the best strikers in the weight class because that wrestling is so strong. It's like I said before, one of the best bases for striking in MMA right now is a good takedown. If you have a good takedown, your striking effectiveness doubles in a fight. You're way more effective in your striking if you have a good takedown. Belal outstruck Leon Edwards up until the end of the fight, where then Leon started to actually let his hands go more. And the reason why he was able to outstrike Leon for most of that fight was because Leon had to respect the takedown at all times. I mean, he got dumped on his head. He had to respect that, or he gets dumped on his head again. So him trying to defend the takedowns, he's getting punched in the face. And then the takedowns get even easier. Even though Leon was trying to defend the takedown, getting punched in the face makes defending takedowns way harder. And the takedown threat makes it harder to defend the punches. Now, regarding the Ian Garry fight, I think Daniel Cormier said that Shavkat was injured in the fight. He had an MCL tear. Well, it's not confirmed. He could have. I mean, these fighters always fight injured. Ian Garry could have had an injury as well. We have no idea. Shavkat's not the one that said it, right? It was Daniel Cormier. So if he was injured, of course, it could have impacted his wrestling in the fight. But at the same time, we've never really seen Shavkat display high-level wrestling compared to Belal and Sean Brady and all these other really good wrestlers at welterweight. And at the same time, we don't know if Garry was injured because, again, neither of the fighters said anything about whether they were injured or not. So this doesn't mean that Shavkat is not a good fighter or not one of the top contenders. He is one of the best welterweights in the world, but I don't think he's the best. I don't think he's the world beater that so many of us thought that he was going to be. Now, he hasn't lost yet. He's still undefeated, but the Ian Garry fight was his first high-level fight. That was the first time he went up against one of the other top welterweights, where now I think Belal could beat him there, Sean Brady could beat him there, and some of the other top welterweights are now competitive with Shavkat Rakhmonov, whereas before I thought Shavkat was better than everybody. But it takes a high-level fighter to fight another high-level fighter in order to know for sure how good that fighter actually is. And that was the fight. It goes to show that, in my opinion, I think Shavkat's really good, but he's not as good as I thought he was before. But that's my rant, guys, on Shavkat's overestimation, maybe, and why fighters need to be more well-rounded, right? So we'll see in the welterweight division who can beat Belal Muhammad, if any of them can. And leave in the comments below, do you guys agree or disagree? The next, several videos are going to be very subjective, just because there's no fights besides the Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk fight. So there's going to be a lot of opinions and stuff like that about various different things that I want to talk about. So it makes it really fun. We all have our own opinions. I hope you guys enjoyed the video at least. And if you guys did, make sure to give the video a like, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and I'll see you guys in the next video.